And good morning. Welcome to the boardroom. My name is Trevor Lutz. I'm the president and CEO of Sandcastle Community Management. Every week we bring you this program called The Boardroom. This is where the professionals gather. This is where we bring really the people that are in the know, the people that know about condominiums, HOAs, co-ops, marinas, any type of shared ownership. These are the people that really are behind the scenes helping you run those communities, those associations, whether you're a board member or a committee member. These are the people you rely on. And today we're lucky enough to have Josh Porter. He's the president for Consult Engineering. He's in the studio. Josh has been a frequent guest here on the show and always sets us straight. Josh, every time you're here, I'm a little smarter, I think.
I appreciate that, and I appreciate being here.
Okay, great. Well, today we're talking about responsible management of the physical property. And every time you're here, I learn a little more, some things that I should be doing for our clients, things that associations should be doing in general. And, let's talk about responsible management. What are we talking about when we talk about responsible physical management of the community?
Well, the community, puts aside members that they trust to govern and to make decisions for them. And this is typically like a board or board of directors. Sometimes you have subcommittees and so on and so forth. But the board members, have an obligation now to the community to make sure that the properties are taken care of, that they're maintained, that they're safe, and that the property values are maintained as well.
And they really have to sort of set aside maybe their own bias in many cases because they may have a short-term horizon for how long they anticipate owning or living at this community. But they have to think globally. They have to think big picture, long-term, don't they?
They really do. And they also need to make sure that they don't have any personal agenda going into this. We've dealt with a lot of...
Boards never have personal agendas. What are you talking about?
We've dealt with, a lot of times we end up dealing with a single person on the board as the liaison. Everybody else goes up north and they leave one guy or gal down here to deal with the engineer and deal with the attorney. And then occasionally that one person has their own agenda. Maybe they feel it's their obligation to save money at all costs. Mm-hmm. But then what happens is every decision that gets weighed by the board gets funneled through this person and it kind of gets tainted or colored a little bit. And the boards need to understand that they have a certain liability for the decisions that they make. And if they make a decision that could cause something detrimental to the community, either in their property values or in their safety, that they could be personally liable for those decisions.
Sure. So we're really talking about, when you're talking about the responsible physical property management, we're talking about working with a board or a group or committee and helping them see overall, globally, what they need to do to maintain the community to protect everyone.
That's correct. Yeah.
And so, let's talk about the resources. What resources or tools do you recommend to boards that they use, and what do they have at their disposal?
Boards really need to recognize that they all come from different backgrounds. They all have different expertise, but typically their expertise is not what's necessary to do what they need to do as far as maintaining and repairing and replacing the physical assets of their property.
Because maintaining that single family home up in Vermont is a little different than this 100-unit condominium down here in Fort Myers.
Yeah, we consulted with a condominium here in Fort Myers actually, and it was an eye opener to them that they didn't even really realize. They were facing a project with their parking garage, and it was going to be about $1 million to fix the parking garage, and they're just shell shocked, at this price. Mm-hmm. And I actually had to sit down and show them that the cost to build the parking garage was $6.5 million. They didn't realize they even had an asset that cost that much.
Sure.
So I think part of that is knowing this information, knowing what does it cost to repair and maintain things, and that first tool, the baseline that all decisions need to be kind of launched off of as a launching pad, is the reserve study. And that having a good solid reserve study prepared by a professional outside of the board is your first good logical step toward that end.
And there's a lot of associations out there that have never had a reserve study done because they've had, quote unquote, their own in-house professionals or experts, people that knew concrete or paint or something up north. And that sort of became the reserve study, the brain trust. But a lot of associations have never actually put down money to have someone do that for them, have they?
No, they haven't. And that's not necessarily the end of the world. The point is that you still want to whatever reserve study or reserve line items that you have created, that still needs to be your launch pad, your discussion point. And you don't wait. If your reserve schedule says you need to replace your roof in 5 years, you don't completely shelve the conversation for 5 years. You want to say every year, okay, are we still going to hit that 5-year mark? What maintenance needs to be done to the roof in order to maintain that and to make sure we hit that 5-year replacement mark?
And those are the kind of discussions you have while you're doing budgets, right? I mean, you're sitting down with the board or with your manager and you're going through the budget. You should be looking at every line item on that reserve.
Correct. And if a good reserve reserve study provider will be able to go and look at those assets and not only determine a realistic remaining useful life for these and a realistic price, but they will be able to tell you if there are things going on, maintenance issues that are having a detrimental effect on your remaining useful life.
Sure. A lot of times when I see boards putting together the useful life, they tinker with that number a little bit, and it's sort of a guess, But if you have a reserve study and you've had experts on your roofs or looking at the stucco or looking at your asphalt, you've got a much better shot of hitting that real number, that real time frame, don't you?
Correct. And the reserve studies being the most important and kind of the baseline of where all your conversations start. The getting back to what are the resources that the board has in order to have what we call responsible management. That's the first step. The next piece of the puzzle that they really need to focus on is making sure that they have experts in their corner advising them, and the primary experts that you need to have in your corner are your property manager, your attorney, and your engineer. And more often than not, I see associations treating the engineer as another vendor. And they're only consulted on a per project basis, and only when somebody complains and says we need an engineer. Right.
Right.
But commonly in the operating budgets, for example, they'll have money in there for property management.
Sure.
They'll have money in there for legal advising, but there's no money in there for engineering advising. And this is really critical because there are a lot of decisions now that are being made by boards and committees without any input. And there's this perception that maybe that input is too expensive, or how do you engage an engineer without having a fixed set of scope of work that you want them to do. And that's one of the things that we now do a lot of is we do kind of these open-ended consulting contracts where we get put on retainer just like your attorney. And when you have any kind of question, any sort of, we're not sure if the landscaper should be doing this, or we're not sure if the roofer is telling us the truth when he told us he needs to repair this or that, a good consulting firm can take a look at those things and advise you. You bring up a valid point because,
every budget has a line item for management unless they're self-managed, but even then they may have some dollars there. They always have something for their attorney. But you're right, they don't put something in for an engineer or other professionals in that way, and they really should because, you don't always... You put $2,000 in your budget for the attorney. That's not saying you're going to spend $2,000. Why not put $2,000 in there for your engineer? Because at some point you may need to pick up the phone, right?
Absolutely. The other thing too is think about consistency, right? I mean, boards come and go, committees come and go. Sometimes even property managers come and go,
yes,
but we like to see a consistency with the property management if we can. And then the attorney, while a lot of times the attorneys are more static with they build a long-term relationship. Nobody knows the building better than an engineer when he gets involved in a project. And then what happens is that if you're treating your engineer or consultant as a vendor, and you're just picking the low bid every time you got a new project coming up, you don't have anybody that consistently knows how that building's put together, how every component works, how the roof is related to this, when this project was done. And a lot of times a good engineering consultant can provide consistency across different boards, across different property managers, and even across different attorneys. They can kind of remind everybody, this is the history of the property, and this is what you need to do to keep moving forward. And when a new issue or problem pops up, they'll know right away how to fix it and how to address it. And
am I correct that becomes more and more important the bigger the community and the older the community, right? The community that's 2 years old, probably not as critical that they have their engineer on retainer, but that community that's 10, 15, 20 years, now it becomes really important, doesn't it?
It's important at all lives, but yes, it does become more important the older and especially the larger and more complex the association is. But even the smaller associations with smaller projects and smaller issues can certainly benefit from that relationship. We have a client right now that has 5 buildings. They have each building painted 1 year after the other, and the painting projects are between $35,000 and $50,000. And they looked at me like I had 2 heads. When I said, "Well, you should have an engineer and consultant on staff to guide you through these projects," but these projects are so small. So then we did a study. We ended up doing a study of their buildings, and it turns out, well, you've had your buildings painted every year for the last 30 years, and not one painting project have they replaced or redone any of the caulking around any of the windows. It was still all original to the building and had completely disintegrated away. That's one of those real basic, common, simple things that a consultant can catch and fix, but a contractor maybe has been kind of shortcutting the job, and none of the board members are really knowledgeable enough to know how to catch it.
Sure. I know a number of our clients have used you for consulting before paint jobs and stucco repairs, just so you can be another set of eyes to look at the scope of work, right?
Absolutely. And we'll provide, levels of service that suit your needs. So, if you need us to really take your hand and just walk you through the whole process, assess the problem, assess the project, develop the specifications and bid it out, and then manage it, we can. If you want us to just say, "Hey, we got a contract in for a roofer to fix this area over here. Can you just give us a second opinion on it?" We can do that as well.
Okay. Tell us about Consult Engineering. Where are you guys based at? What do you do?
Consult Engineering, we do consulting for mostly condo and homeowner associations all throughout Southwest Florida. We have offices in Bonita Springs, Port Charlotte, and Sarasota. And we have been doing this for a little over 5 years now, and we focus specifically only on this one industry and only on this type of service. You can reach us at a 1-800 number. It's 1-800-550-3379, or you can check out our website at consultengineering.com.
Excellent. We're talking about responsible management of the physical property here in the boardroom. Josh Porter in the studio from Consult Engineering. More to come. Stick with us. And welcome back to the boardroom. My name is Traver Lutz, President and CEO of Sandcastle Community Management, locally owned property management firm specializing in condominiums, HOAs, co-ops, marinas, you name it. We can assist you with that. And every week we bring you the boardroom. We bring you the experts, people that you need to hear from, people that are going to make your association a little smarter, a little wiser, and maybe run a little better. And today is no different. We're lucky enough to have Josh Porter. He's the president for Consult Engineering. He's in the studio. Today we're talking about responsible management of the physical property. And Josh, we started off the segment talking about, what the responsibilities are of the association and some of the tools at their disposal. I want to go back. We sort of just touched on it lightly, but we talked about reserve studies, and we mentioned the importance of it. Let's talk about the reserve study. And I know you guys do a lot of reserve studies for associations. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, the reserve study is really a study of all of the major repair replacement costs associated with the common area elements. One of the things I try to explain to people when we do reserve studies to our clients is that this is truly a budgeting tool. We're trying to project the price of a roof, for example, 10 years from now. Mm-hmm. So, what we're trying to do is we're trying to use our best engineering judgment. We're trying to use, real world costs from recent roofing projects, and we're trying to put that in there and come up with a best guessed budget tool. I think a lot of consultants, reserve analysts, engineers maybe get thrown under the bridge sometimes because they say, well, we had $200,000 in here for our roofing project, and it ended up costing $240,000, and we had a completely useless reserve study. So these are one of those conversations I try to have with associations, and we try to talk about the way it gets funded, pooled funding, how do you protect yourself against overages, and those types of conversations.
Now, a lot of times reserve studies I've seen, and not particularly yours, but they seem to be padded, and they're almost hedging, not knowing what the again, you're projecting something 15 years out, a roof or some other major maintenance on the property. Who knows what the costs are going to be? And so a lot of times they come in a little high on those, don't they?
They do. The prices can be padded, and as long as you can justify it and make sense mathematically, I think that's okay.
I'd rather end up with too much money for that item than not enough. So.
Right. For example, a good example is building restoration. So let's say you had a concrete project done, and we know restoration for coastal properties occurs on a 7 to 10 year cycle. So you spent $250,000 on the concrete repairs for your building. You might find in your reserve study that it's $325 that the engineer put in there. And part of the reason for that is because it's those projects by their very nature have so many unknown elements
Sure.
that the next one might be over.
Absolutely.
So what we do is, in some of the line items, a good consultant will plan for an appropriate amount of contingency that gets baked into these numbers for these different projects. The types of the reserve studies that we can commonly provide, and that affects how these numbers play out as well. If you've never had a reserve study done, or maybe you had one done a while ago, a lot of times you'll hire a reserve study provider, and you'll have them come out and do what's called a full reserve study. So they're going to come out, they're going to physically assess or visually assess every asset that you have, take photos, record the information, prepare the reserve study, and present it to you. Some other options are, the update. So maybe you're just hiring the consultant to do an update of your reserve study, and those updates can come either with or without a site visit, and a lot of that depends on the circumstances surrounding it.
Now, those full studies, people are sometimes a little shocked because when you come out and do a full study and you talk about every component, those lights that are hanging outside of your door on your garden style unit, those eventually will have to be replaced. And so those get incorporated, right? Just about every component.
It does, but it really depends association by association. Some associations have a threshold in their operating costs for dealing with, the occasional light fixture replacement and stuff like that. Other associations we've done, they say, no, we want to replace every light fixture on every walkway, for example, at the same time. Well, at first you're talking about maybe $300 per location. It's no big deal. We'll just deal with them as they break under operating costs or under a maintenance agreement, perhaps. But then if you have an association that says, well, no, we really need to replace these things all at once. They're outdated. They're all going to have the problem in the next couple of years. Then now you're taking, $300 a location by, hundreds of locations. And now you actually have a line item that really should be in the reserve study. So part of determining that is sitting down as a reserve study provider and sitting down with the boards and discussing these items, and a lot of times just discussing them with the property managers, because they tend to know a lot more even than the boards do what gets replaced typically out at this property or what doesn't.
Now, I know you like to do the site visits when you're doing your updates on reserve studies, and I think that's important because I've seen some reserve studies by other companies where they do the update not knowing what has actually occurred and what type of maintenance may have been deferred or may have already been done, and then you don't have an accurate study at that point, right?
That's true, and we have to disclose that information too. So I have some clients that will hire us and they'll say, well, we want you to update our reserve study, and we had this reserve study done by such and such 2 years ago. And I say, okay, well, we really need to come out and reevaluate all these assets and make sure that those numbers make sense. Well, we don't want to pay for that, they're pinching pennies or whatever. And so what happens is we can provide whatever level of service they need, but per the best practices guide for reserve studies, we have to disclose this type, what went into it.
Sure.
So we have to disclose that, hey, we didn't get to see this. We use numbers provided to us by the client. And then this goes back full circle to what we opened up the show on, was talking about, liability and issues. So if I prepare a reserve study and I've got in my disclaimers that it's all based on information provided to me by the board,
sure,
then when things go wrong down the road,
the liability falls back on the board, doesn't it?
You got it, right. And the goal here for responsible management is to constantly push responsibility off of the board and onto professionals. You want professionals, you want to be relying on their advice and their knowledge.
And of course, by statute, the board can never release their responsibility or liability completely, but to make it easier and allow them to sleep better at night and to make the community better, they really need to lean on professionals like their engineer, their attorney, their CPA, right?
Absolutely.
Let's talk a little bit about what some of the components are that typically you're doing in reserve studies. There's some where they have to do those components, and there's others that they add on, right?
That's correct. The Florida statutes kind of list some basic items that need to be in there, and then we've kind of added some of that to the list as well. The three big ones are the roofing, painting, and paving, and whether you're doing asphalt pavers or concrete or asphalt, brick pavers or asphalt, that needs to be in there. And then the statutes state any other item over $10,000, and then you can start splitting hairs on that. But one of the things I try to do is I try to sit down with association boards and I try to work through a set of questions to try to help them figure out what those items would be. One of the first questions you want to ask is that common area element asset, is it covered under a maintenance contract? Because if it is, it doesn't need to be brought into the reserve study. You're kind of double dipping on that item. Is it even a common building component? I've seen associations have a line item in there for screen enclosures, and then it turns out that the screen enclosures were actually owned by the individual unit owners, right? Yeah. Right. So you got to kind of ask that question: does the asset age over time? For example, we don't put in there a line item for the masonry block units themselves that make up the walls, okay? But we do have a line item in there for stucco, which goes on top of the brick, or on top of the masonry. So, you have to kind of ask that question. Is it a component that ages? And usually only the consultant can really answer that question. So some of these are questions for the boards. Some of these are questions for the consultant.
Now, one of the things that comes up all the time, and boards ask, should we be reserving for our paver driveways because you've got paver stones, and should we be reserving for our irrigation? Because both of those, if you had to replace them in totality, way over $10,000. So what are you seeing out there?
I'm seeing that the pavers we definitely put in there into the reserve studies for a full replacement at X amount of years, depending on the quality of the paver and what we're talking about in the location. Irrigation is one of those that I tend to prefer to. I tend to recommend to associations that you get on a maintenance and repair and replacement contract for your irrigation. It's pretty rare that you're going to take your entire irrigation system, rip the whole thing up and out, and completely redo it on a cycle. And even if we could determine that cycle, it's very hard to say, okay, well, this irrigation system is going to last 10 years, or is it going to last 20 years with proper maintenance? Who really knows? So a lot of times, what we recommend is that be covered under a maintenance contract with an irrigation company.
So when you're looking at the big ones, the roof, the painting, the paving, you're going out there, you're physically inspecting these, you're doing an analysis on them, you're coming up with some good faith estimates of the remaining life, which is really valuable for the budget purposes, and then obviously the cost.
That's correct. And a lot of times when we come up with the remaining useful life, for example, and roofs are an easy example to use in this context. When we look at a roof, we'll look, okay, well, there's, the lap seams are coming apart. There's some electrical conduit that's not right up there. There's an area over here that's holding water. So I might issue the report and I might say, listen, you've got 7 years left on this roof. But then under the maintenance observations section of the report, I'm going to say, that this is contingent on you fixing these problems, though, that we observed. So it's not a real detailed condition assessment, but we do go around and we look at those things and we try to look for obvious things that are going to affect the useful life. You'll get 7 years out of your roof, but if you don't do any of the maintenance repairs, who knows? It could, you could need to replace your roof in a year, 2 years, who knows? One
of the things I love about having you come out, and there's some other engineering firms as well that Sandcastle has worked with, but is that when you're coming out, we know you're not trying to sell us something. You're selling us your expertise. You're not selling us paint for the buildings or the labor that goes in with it. You're not selling us roofing shingles. So you're truly there to analyze the condition and determine how much life it has left. And we don't have to worry about you pushing something on us, right?
That's correct. I actually had a contract to replace a roof. So, we had to contract to bid it out and oversee the project and everything else. But step one is, of course, going out and assessing and evaluating that asset. So when we went out and walked the roof, we realized that the roof was only about 6 years old. You should have been able to get another 9 years out of it.
Right.
But there was some repairs. It had been leaking. So because it had been leaking, they assumed it needed replaced. And the roofers, 3 different roofers, all came out and told them it needed replaced.
Sure.
So when we went out there and looked at it, we said, well, actually, you can get a lot more life out of this. And we ended up saving them a lot of money in the long run.
Okay. Well, we're talking about responsible management of the physical property. Josh Porter's in the studio. He's the president for Consult Engineering. How do people get a hold of you after the show, Josh?
You can call us at 1-800-550-3379, or you can check us out on the internet at consultengineering.com.
More to come with Josh. Stick with us. And we appreciate you joining us here on The Boardroom. My name is Traver Lutz. Every Saturday morning, we bring you The Boardroom. We bring you the professionals, people that you need to hear from to make your association, your condominium, your HOA, or your co-op run a little smoother. And today we're lucky enough to have Consult Engineering in the studio. Josh Porter, he's the president and the founder of Consult Engineering. He's in the studio, local engineering firm specializing in really associations. That's what you do a lot of your work is, isn't it, Josh?
That's it.
Yeah. We were talking about the last segment. We were talking about reserve studies. There's a lot of confusion out there. There's a bunch of people out there offering reserve studies. I think maybe Sandcastle started offering reserve studies, but that's a joke. But what should we be looking for in a company that does association reserve studies, and what should we be looking for?
The first thing you want to do when you're looking for a company that provides reserve studies is you want to be looking for an example. Ask for a sample. I can't tell you how many reserve studies I've bid and won, and nobody ever asked me for a sample of one of my reserve studies.
So it could have been a one-page document.
They assume. I always call it the assumption of equality.
Right.
They assume that all things are equal, and boy, people provide different studies all over the place.
Sure.
The best practices guide for reserve studies gives us kind of a list of things to look for in a good reserve study. So when you get that sample, look for these items. One, you want to see a description of the type of study that was performed. Was it a full study? Was it an update with site visit? Whatever. And you want to see a description of what methods did they use to obtain the valuation and life estimates. A lot of providers only pull information out of books, and they don't have any real world numbers because they don't actually manage projects. They're just a company that does reserve studies, which is fine. That has their own merit to it. But sometimes you might want a company that can provide more detailed information based on real project costs. Because
there could be some local issues that affect the cost of that project or the lifespan of it, right?
Absolutely. A good example is you can say, okay, well, this guy has a flat roof. It's a modified bit roof, and it's 100 squares. I'm going to look it up in the book, and it's going to cost this much. A good engineer who manages projects can go out there and be like, wow, the access to this is crazy. We're going to need a certain kind of crane to get the materials up there. And then, of course, there's air conditioning units that are going to need to be brought up. The stands are going to need to be brought up to codes. That's going to be an extra cost. So we can incorporate those proper costs in there based on real project expectations.
And there may be 5 great flat roofers out there that are all vying for the job, which would drive the cost down too, right?
Absolutely, yeah. The other things you want to look for when you're looking at the sample reserve study, and I'll just kind of go through them real quick, is you want to look for a tabulated list of the components. And it should have a description of each. It should have the replacement costs, both current and future. It should have the total useful life and the remaining useful life. The reserve study should also have a good description of the current and projected reserve fund figures, and a description and result of the reserve plans that the provider is presenting. So you're going to kind of say, okay, here's your current financial situation with regard to reserves, and here's some plans for how to fund to cover all of these assets.
And that's important. If we're going to put this plan together, we need to know how to fund it.
Right. One of the things I always caution people about is finding a reserve study and it's 80 pages long, and you realize that, 75 pages of it is just complete fluff. The reality is that there's not a lot to a reserve study as far as content that needs to be in there. The content, what's important is that the content is done correctly. You want to avoid, reserve studies that have page after page after page. I've seen some where an entire page is just a picture of an air conditioning unit with a brief description below it, and that's a whole page.
So we can't expect your picture on page 1 of Consultant Engineering's reserve study?
No, you're not going to find a reserve study from us that has 60 pages of photos. We can provide you with photos because we do take them if you want them, but no, it's completely unnecessary for what people actually care about. What you care about is how much money do I need to put in the reserves to cover these assets.
Okay. What else should we be looking for? What have we missed?
Walk around the property and do your own evaluation as board members or as committee members and see if anything was missed. I see so many reserve studies that are given to me that were done by previous people, and they're asking me to come out and either update them or do our own study. And it'll be a multi-story building with walkways, and there won't be any line item in there for the aluminum railing. And it's like aluminum railing does not last forever, especially on these coastal buildings and stuff, and that needs to be replaced. So walk around and put on your common sense hat and say, okay, is that something that's going to last forever? And if it's not, where is it on my reserve study? And then the other thing too to look for is do the numbers make sense? A lot of associations have historical pricing. Rely on your property manager. What did we pay for a roof 5 years ago, 6 years ago? You might not even have lived there 5 or 6 years ago when that roof was done, but somebody has those records, and you should be able to pull them and then say, okay, does this make sense with the price we're getting from the reserve study provider?
Okay. What are some of the other aspects of associations should consider in this process when they're looking at the reserve studies? I mean, not every association needs a reserve study, right? I mean, if you're a 12-unit condo and you're 10 years old, do you need a reserve study?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
I would say you need some sort of reserve study. Absolutely. I mean, reserve studies can be done for $1,500. They can be done for $10,000. It really depends on the size of the association and the property. The problem is a lot of the providers that are providing these studies with all this fluff, all of a sudden now they've created a product that's so large that they can't actually provide it for a real small association. So you're still going to get bids from them for $3,500 or $4,500 or whatever to do a reserve study because they don't know how to do a small reserve study for a small association. In any case, though, it can really benefit those folks.
And regardless of what size reserve study you do, you need to document it and you need to keep it, right? Because all of the official records have to be kept for at least 7 years. And so if they do this reserve study, even if they do it in-house, they need to maintain it somehow. So later on they can justify why they did what they did.
Absolutely. I see a lot of associations who will take a professional reserve study from a very good company, and then they will proceed to self-manage and self-update that reserve study as time goes on. And the interesting thing that a lot of people don't know, a lot of the calculations and formulas that are going into there are not something you can just do at home on your own spreadsheet. I mean, it takes some real calculation and some more detailed formulas to actually calculate what these projections should be. So a lot of times, associations will end up putting more money away than they need to, or too little money away than they need to, because they're not actually having the calculations properly updated every couple years.
I think one of the biggest dangers I see, and I've seen several fairly new clients that have come on board, and they had these great reserve studies that were done very well. Lots of pictures, but they were done well. And then they chose not to use most of it. They said, "Oh, we really don't need to do that. That's not a big deal. We'll worry about that when the time comes." And they bring some liability upon themselves, I think.
They do, and the statutes do allow, I believe, for partial funding. That's something more I leave to attorneys and property managers to figure out. But I do believe that the statutes allow an association to what we call partially fund. Okay, well, we're going to fund everything but the roof because that's just such a big number or something like that. And that happens a lot, and it's sad because what we're moving towards now is an understanding where this is going to start affecting property values. We're moving into this phase now where realtors are asking, what is the current status of the reserves? What can I have a copy of the reserve study? And smart buyers that are buying $1 million condo might want to know, okay, well, am I going to buy this condo and then get hit with a $55,000 assessment tomorrow?
Absolutely.
They want to know that they're protected. And if there's no reserves or the reserves are underfunded, it actually devalues the properties, because now me as a potential buyer, let's say, I have to account for the fact that you're not completely covered. I don't know. And that uncertainty can lower property values, certainly.
Now, you started off the show sort of talking about that team effort of successfully managing a community and responsibly managing it. Let's go back to that, because this is the case where if a board has that reserve study and they choose not to use some of it, they ought to be talking to their attorney, maybe their insurance broker as well. Hey, what are the dangers of us not using this? Right?
Correct. And, we talked about how the reserve study is a launch pad for making decisions about responsible management, because it's your list of assets. So it makes sense that would be your launching pad. But the party members that need to be a part of your team for dealing with every single project or every single capital repair replacement issue on that reserve study, your team should consist of 4 major components, and that's the board, the property manager, your attorney, and your engineer. So, for example, you're coming up to a building painting project, and the reserve study says it's going to be approximately $350,000 to paint the building. Your first step is to say, okay, let's put the team together, not let's call contractors and get prices. The first goal should be put the team together, and then once the team is together and you've got your engineer and you've got your attorney and you've got your property manager, everybody can dole out responsibilities. Okay, the attorney is going to review the contract and he's going to make sure that the notice of commencement is written, and the engineer is going to prepare the project specifications and the manual and bid it out, and everybody has their roles assigned beforehand. These projects run incredibly smooth, and there's not a lot of missed loose ends. When you go directly to the contractors, okay, we're coming up on a roofing project, right? We keep talking about roofing, but we come up on our roofing project on our reserve study. Let's just start calling roofing contractors. You're going to get 5 different bids, 5 different products, 5 different methodologies on how to do that project. So you really need to assemble the team first, get your plan of action in order, and then proceed with tackling that reserve line item.
And you absolutely want your attorney involved in that point because they're going to be reviewing. One of the most important things I think they can review, not on the roofing project, but on other projects, is who's really responsible for doing this. Is the association responsible? You talked about screening and lanais, and in some cases, depending on the governing documents, different parties may own different parts of that lanai screen and the framing. So you need to know that before you embark on replacing it.
Yeah, I mean, I've had projects where people came out and said, hey, put together a bid specs and let's get this project bid out. We need to have our building restored. And then when I asked them, well, who owns the screen enclosures? They kind of scratched their head. Well, I don't know. So, in that case, they just put me directly in contact with their attorney and we were able to figure it out together. But again, that all plays back to putting that team together ahead of time and get those questions answered before you get too far ahead of yourself.
We're talking responsible management of the physical property, Consult Engineering. We've got Josh Porter in the studio. Josh, people are going to have a lot of questions about the screening material and all, and we've got more to come. How do they get a hold of you, though, if they need to talk to you directly?
Call us at 1-800-550-3379 or check us out on the internet at consultengineering.com.
We've got more to come here in the boardroom. Stick with us. And welcome back to the boardroom. My name is Traver Lutz. This is the boardroom. This is the radio authority of Southwest Florida. This is where you find everything you want to know about condominiums, HOAs, co-ops, marinas, commercial parks, any type of a shared ownership community or association. This is where you're going to get the answers. We're lucky enough today to have Josh Porter. One the president for Consult Engineering. He's in the studio. We've been talking about the responsible management of the physical property. And Josh, during one of the earlier segments, we were talking about the benefits of having a consultant, like an engineer on retainer. And that many times you have your attorney on retainer and you've got your CPA a lot of times on a retainer. So you can pick up the phone, ask those quick questions, bat some ideas around with them. But why don't people have their engineer on a retainer?
I don't know. I mean, I think the perspective has been a lot of times is that the engineer is like another vendor, and every job you get a new engineer and you get a new bid and you go with low bid and all that stuff. I have a couple clients, and I'm not going to lie and say, oh yeah, all my clients, they got me on retainer. That would be nice and wonderful, right. But that's not realistic. The few that I do have, though, I mean, they have, Mr. Smith upstairs, he wants to put a 1,500-pound sculpture in the middle of his unit. Can the floor handle that? Well, I'll check it real quick, and I'll check the calculation, and I'll shoot him an email back, and I'll say, yeah, that's fine at that location. And, and you get a bill for $100, $200, whatever. I mean, that's not something you had to go out and bid to an engineer. And then that answer was available to you within 24 hours usually. So you're getting knowledge, you're getting information, you're keeping things safe for such a minuscule amount of money per occurrence or per question. And
those kind of questions come up all the time. Not the not the sculpture, but I've had communities, high rises, that they want to put a hot tub on a balcony, or they wanted to reconfigure the interior of the unit, and those kind of questions. Boards sort of go it alone, don't they? Or they rely on a contractor, a general contractor who's getting paid to do the work. They're relying on his expertise. And a lot of times the contractor goes and hires the engineer, or the association does hire an engineer, but you're hiring them on that case basis, right? So you're hiring an engineer, and he comes out and he says, well, I got to look at the building, I got to look at the plans, I got to look at this. For example, that sculpture example, which was a real example, that client I've been working with for over 3 years. I have an intimate knowledge of the building and the plans and the drawings. So we were actually able to save the association a lot of money by not having to reinvent the wheel. We were there for their painting project. We've been there for their plaza deck and amenity project, a waterproofing project. So we already have a deep, intimate knowledge of the building and how it was put together. And we also did expert witness work for them. So for one of their legal cases. So in that case, they're able to call us, and we're able to just quickly give them responses and answers back, and not have to do a lot of digging and a lot of research and spend 8-10 hours on a task. We can spend 1 hour on it and save them quite a bit of money that way. And you also become sort of a referral source too, don't you? I mean, when someone calls up and says, hey, we're thinking about using XYZ, I mean, chances are you've worked with XYZ and you've seen their work and you've seen what the good and the bad, right?
That's correct. Yeah. And like, for example, when we take on projects and we put together contractors on a bidding list, it's always nice to be able to say to the client, yes, I have personally, we have personally managed this contractor, or we have seen this contractor's workmanship. And then of course there's situations where maybe the board has a previous relationship with a contractor and they want them included in the bid list. I don't have anything against that, but at least they go forward knowing that contractors A, B, C were contractors that Consult has managed before and seen, but maybe contractor D he doesn't know. So it's more of an unknown. So if D happens to be the low bidder, at least the board knows going in that there's some unknown with this. The engineer has not worked with them personally before.
Sure. Josh, we like to take listener questions, and every time you're on the show, there's a lot of people that have questions, and we're going to give your phone number in just a little while again because people will have questions we can't get to today. But if you want to get involved, it's simply just email us. It's listen@sandcastleradio.com. We've got some coming in. Do you want to jump into these, see if we can answer some of these?
Absolutely. Let's do them.
We've got an email here from Roberta. She's in Fort Myers. She says there have been several times in the past year that our board has embarked on projects that we could have used some professional help. Unfortunately, none of us are sure when we should be seeking the assistance of an engineer. Is there a rule of thumb as to when we should call upon an engineering firm to assist? Obviously, we should if we need to get a permit. It requires professional services. But when else should we be looking to companies like yours? And I think you've sort of covered that. I mean, I guess whenever you need them, whenever there's a question, right?
Yeah, I mean, my preference would be to use this more often than not. I mean, a good consulting company like ours will tell you, that's okay. You don't need us for that. Well, we need to replace the sidewalk in front of our building, and the bid that we got from the contractor is going to be, $2,300. Okay, well, I can take a look at it for you, and it'll cost you $100 or $200 or whatever for us to review the bid and write you back an email. Or you could just take it on yourself. It's a pretty small project, no big deal. So we do have some kind of rules of thumb. One of the big ones is the $50,000 mark. I mean, if your project is over $50,000, even if it's replacing multiple air conditioning units or something odd that you wouldn't think you would want to hire a building consultant for, if it's over $50,000, that's your baseline, because that's when we start making sense financially. Under $50,000, if you have a $35,000 project, you might not be able to get an engineer in there to manage it and bid it out for less than $5,000. So let's say. So now you're up at 12, 13, 14% of your entire project cost is on your engineer. Kind of doesn't make sense. When you start getting over that $50,000 threshold, any of those projects make sense. Roofing, painting, paving, building restoration, railing replacement, window replacement, all those things that are going to cost you any sort of big ticket item, those are the ones you want an engineer on.
Man, I always like your honesty too, because you and I have had that conversation a couple of times for clients. They said, hey, bring an engineer out here. You and I discussed it. I shoot you a couple of pictures of what's going on. And you've said to me, hey, Trevor, you don't need me for this. This is what you should be doing, right?
Right, absolutely.
Yeah, and so that's why you want that relationship. That's why you want Josh on speed dial, I guess.
You really do. Yeah, exactly.
We got an email here from Paul in Naples. He says our HOA recently re-asphalted all the streets in our neighborhood. This was an expensive project, but we went with a low bidder who was much cheaper than the other contractors. I suspect, however, that we got ripped off and that corners were cut. How would you help us determine if we got what we were supposed to get?
Well, we've done this before, this exact type of situation. And, the first step is to always review the documents. Honestly, once I see the contract that was put together between the contractor and the association, I can give you a little bit of insight, but as to whether it's even worth pursuing or not. And then the other person really that has much better information than that would be your attorney. Send your contract to your attorney. Do we have a leg to stand on? Do we have anything? Because I've seen some very poorly written contracts that leave the association completely exposed and unable to recover.
And he asked whether we got what we were supposed to get. Well, if your contract didn't lay out exactly what you were supposed to get, then it's really going to be your opinion versus the asphalt company, right?
That's true. But even if the asphalt company puts together, or any contractor puts together the scope of work and the contract, there's still typically a scope of work. And so there's sometimes still the question, did we get what we paid for? And in that case, we would go out and we would do the site evaluation after reviewing the documents. And if necessary, particularly for this gentleman's asphalt project, we would look at the asphalt and we would even have it tested, have some corings taken, and then issue a report with our opinion on whether they got what they were supposed to get.
I know you helped one of our clients and you determined that they didn't get a good job, but they did get what they contracted for, because the poor contract, poor scope of work, and they got what they paid for, but they didn't get anything worthwhile.
Yeah, and that was actually one of those situations where you put the team together, right? Yeah. So we went out and said, you didn't get what you paid for, and so then they took that report and that information, and they took the contract and they sent it off to their attorney, and the attorney said, okay, we understand that you didn't get what you paid for, but unfortunately, your contract stinks. Right. So this is one of those things, going full circle, why you want that attorney involved.
Sure.
Before you ever even entered the contract with the road guys and the asphalt company. And then okay, so he can make sure you're covered and protected under your contract, but who makes sure that the asphalt company is actually doing the right thing? Should you have a resurfacing? Should you have a milling job done? Should you have a complete tear out done? Who is making that determination? It shouldn't be the contractor. Some contractors specialize in tear out. Some specialize in milling. Some specialize in this or that. So you really want to have the engineer up front saying, this is the right fix for your problem.
And the big red flag that Paul addresses, when in his email is that, the bid was much, much lower than the other contractor. So that's a huge red flag. If you as an engineer had developed the scope of work, all the bids probably are going to fall right about the same place. When you have one that's an outlier like that, it raises some red flags.
It does. Most of our jobs, when we bid them out, we'll have roughly a 10 to 15% spread from low bid to high bid. So you've kind of done your job putting together the specifications in a good project manual. I have a project we're actually managing right now. The client hired the low bidder, and he was way lower than everybody else. And we actually advised the association that we don't see how this contractor is going to be able to do this job for this price. And so at least they had that knowledge beforehand, and they said, okay, well, you know what? He's so much lower. Even if he ends up coming back, and asking for extra money or whatever, we're just going to plan for it in the contingency because it's still cheaper than going with the next guy. Right. And that was the decision they went with, and they rolled the dice a little bit, and it actually went in their favor. The project's gone smoothly, and on budget. So it kind of worked out in their favor, and he is doing it for the price he said. Whether he's making money or not, I don't know.
Okay. We got an email here from Janice on Marco Island. She says we are working on paint specs for our mid-rise, and while we have consulted with several paint contractors and a paint manufacturer rep, several directors believe that we need to have an additional consultant, such as an engineer, preparing the specs and supervising the paint project. I personally think this is overkill. Is there value to having you or another engineering firm involved in a paint project? People think paint, it's easy, just slap it up, right? But there's a lot more to it than that.
Oh, absolutely. And painting is one of my pet peeves because the manufacturers do provide specifications, and they provide specifications for caulking, painting, priming, and those types of things. But then there's really no specification for what do you do if you come across some delaminated stucco? What do you do if you come across a stucco joint that's not properly sealed or done correctly? What do you do when you come across a concrete damage on a slab edge? And I have walked so many buildings that have been painted with no oversight, and major concrete spalls and stucco damage is literally just caulked until the hole is sealed, and then it's just painted over, and you can't see the problem from down below, but it continues growing like a cancer. But the sales pitch from me is, to have us oversee, bid, and manage these types of jobs is typically 5% or less of the entire project cost.
Sure, and it's going to pay for itself long term as the building maintains its value.
Absolutely.
Josh, if people are going to have questions, they're going to wait to come out, take a look at their paint, their spalling concrete, all their ills, how do they get a hold of you?
You can check us out on the internet. That's at consultengineering.com, or you can call us at 1-800-550-3379.
We thank you for joining us here on the Boardroom. My name is Trevor Lutz. Until next week, we wish you well. Bye-bye.